So my career basically started as a photojournalist, and in 1989 working for the local papers, the Harrow Observer and the Wembley Observer. And this is a shot of me on assignment in 1990, a year in. I've always liked small cameras. I started shooting with Leica M cameras right at the beginning of my career. Initially a borrowed one, and eventually I saved up enough to buy a second-hand one. And as soon as sort of digital mirrorless cameras came in, with the first one being the EP1, I jumped on getting one because I've always liked working with small, lightweight, inconspicuous cameras. And last year sort of formed a decade of digital mirrorless shooting for me. So here's a slide showing the EP1, which sort of started it off for me, the Leica M9, which was the first digital Leica that I enjoyed shooting with. And then fast forward to the phenomenal Lumix S1R, which was launched last year, and then the Sigma FP, which is the smallest full-frame mirrorless camera on the bottom right, which is mind-blowing considering how small it is. Fast forwarding to 94, I decided to take a trip to a country called Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an enclave of Armenia, which was at war with Azerbaijan. In the age of 24, I decided that this was a story that I wanted to cover, so I went out to Karabakh, and I just want to share with you some images and moments that I saw. All of this was, of course, shot on film using a couple of Leicas. I took an M6 and a M4 along with me. And although I'd worked on serious news stories back in London, including things like an IRA car bomb in Wembley, this was the most kind of real life situation I found myself in, and it taught me a lot about life and values and sort of putting everything into perspective. When I arrived at the front line, initially I was a bit annoyed in one way, because a ceasefire had been called literally kind of a couple of days before I got there. But on reflection, it was the best thing that happened, because, you know, being totally inexperienced and finding oneself in the middle of a frontline sort of battle isn't probably the wisest thing to do. So a lot of this reportage was sort of life on the front line, keeping watch. There was the occasional shooting and the occasional, sadly, the occasional death from incoming fire. But it was sort of life as sort of soldiers' experience. This was the first piece of meat that they'd had in weeks. Usually it was sort of vegetable stews that would make it to the soldiers in the trenches. And the first thing they did was offer me this sort of piece of, I'm not even sure what it was. It took a lot of effort to decline their kind invitation, because it's just the hospitality of Armenians and people from Karabakh. And of course, the sad reality of war is that there's many, many repercussions that echo through any society that is unfortunate enough to sort of go through this inhumanity of mankind. This is a gravesite of a 19-year-old soldier, and obviously his family mourning his passing. And that normal joy of childhood that you see seems to completely disappear, because, as I say, the repercussions ripple through society, and probably most families have lost someone, either immediate family member or a relative in the fighting. And an Australian photographer who was there sort of handed out these little mini Mars bars to these kids, and it's the first time they would have tasted such a chocolate. But this is the joy of eating delicious foreign chocolate. You know, any other kid in a situation outside of a war would, of course, show such joy. So this picture sort of ripples a lot for me, has much meaning for me. preparing for the winter. Of course, when all the young men are out sort of on the front lines, the older generation have to step up and do stuff which maybe they may not necessarily do. And this guy was collecting firewood at the sort of middle of August, getting ready for the winter that was coming. This lady's preparing lunch at the army base back in one of the towns away from the front line. And I got into the army base and found this guy writing a letter to his mother.
Here's what I found.
This chap, I bumped into him on the street. He was sort of walking around, and I asked him where he was going, and he said he's going to church to pray. And I asked if he'd mind if I joined him, and he said, no, of course not. And we walked into this church, and he started to climb up this sort of very small, narrow stairway. And so I followed him up, and then he sort of got onto a ledge, and he went into the dome, into the top of this dome, which is an off-limits area, of course. And I asked him what he was doing there, why we'd climbed up to this place. And he said, when I'm higher up, my voice is nearer to God, and hopefully he can hear my prayers. It's very moving. And this is, next couple of pictures are from a hospital. This chap was very, very badly wounded in a tank. And although you can't see from the picture, he's got a huge fracture of his skull, and the doctors didn't give him much chance of surviving past the next couple of days. As a consequence of war, both these guys were shot in the spine and were left disabled. And roll on a few more years, this is to 98, and I got an assignment to photograph the 10th anniversary of the earthquake in Armenia. And I was on assignment for an American magazine called AIM. And I made 2 trips, each trip lasting for 2 weeks, to the northern parts of Armenia, primarily to 2 cities called Spitak and Gyumri. Which Spitak was the biggest city closest to the epicenter, and Gyumri was the biggest city sort of in the region that was also devastated. That's a shot of me in all the winter gear I could put on, because temperatures were sort of dropping to about -23, -24 degrees, and with no heating, it soon gets sort of very, very brisk. So this kid's on his way to school. And there's nothing to do, you know, people just hang out, living amongst the ruins. And remember, this earthquake wasn't yesterday. This was 10 years before this picture was taken. This lady was trapped in her house as it toppled on top of her, and sadly lost both of her legs. She was a double amputee. But the prosthetics are so uncomfortable. These are sort of very old Soviet-style things that she just gave up, and she prefers being in a wheelchair because it doesn't cause her as much pain. This chap, he's only 54, but he looks several decades older than that. And this is what grief does to a person. He lost his entire family in the earthquake, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and he lives in a little wooden hut. And these are pictures he managed to rescue from the rubble of his family. This chap was extremely, extremely sick, and I bumped into his brother behind him, and his wife, and they were sort of slipping and sliding through the ice and the snow and trying to go down a valley. And I asked them, you know, what they were doing in this sort of, it was quite dangerous. And he said, I'm visiting my brother because he's sick. So we visit him every day. So they kindly let me tag along with them, and spent some time talking to this guy. And, you know, in these situations, life really is so tough. His name is Ruben. So Ruben's family juggle the little money that they have weekly, and 1 week they'll buy food and 1 week they'll buy his medicine. and there's never 1 week where they have both. So they have to decide, you know, what's most urgent in these sort of desperate times. And this is on the actual day of the anniversary. So these are villagers in a small village called Nalband making their way to the cemetery to remember their dead. But occasionally you find the joy of childhood, and this little girl really lifted my spirits. Wonderful sort of moment to see on the way to the cemetery. One of the very interesting cultural things about Armenians, and there's other cultures that have a similar thing, is that they'll take food and drink to the grave sites to have a meal and have a drink with their departed. And this family sort of brought some food and some vodka, and this is the chap's mother who climbed up to be closer to him. The interesting thing is they never take anything back with them. They always leave the food and a drink for the soul of the departed. I mean, reality is the homeless then come and have a meal, which is great anyway. And the really sad thing is seeing how many children perished. Everywhere you looked in these graveyards was these photorealistic hand engravings made from pictures of sort of better times. This is an entire family wiped out. And as desperation continued, people started looking for ways to make money, to sort of put food on the table. And these guys realized that there's so much metal in the sort of crumbled foundations that were dumped outside the cities that they could recycle the metal rods and sell them to make some money. This is in Gyumri, and when Armenia was part of the Soviet Union, Lenin had ordered the destruction of churches, and so this city didn't have a church. And the first thing they did with all of the aid that started turning up was they took some of the corrugated metal and put together this amazing looking church, because the more religious feared that this was God teaching them a lesson for not having a church in the city. And this is on the 10th anniversary as well. And I walked into this annex of this large church, and I was standing there looking at the light, and all of a sudden this lady came in and, oblivious to my presence, just started to pray. And it was an amazing sight. And technically this is shot on slide film on a Leica, so very, very basic light metering. So it was a case of make my best educated light reading and then take the image and then start bracketing. And amazingly, the first shot was got the sort of the correct exposure, which was quite nice. Right, enough depressing stuff. I'm going to move on and talk about some slightly more light-hearted stuff. And this is the reality of a photojournalist career, is that you go from extreme to extreme, extremes of silly things like fashion shows or movie premieres to real life and death situations and the reality of life. And this is one of the things that I love about my job, is that I get to see the full spectrum of life. Most sort of normal people have their circle of life, and their friends will be in a similar circle and their work will be in a similar circle. But as a newspaper journalist, you get to see all extremes. You know, you could be hanging out with billionaires and royalty, and in the same day hanging out with a homeless person. So I've always found that fascinating and enriching as a way to understand life. But this is my sort of the more commercial side of my work. So for many years, I was shooting campaigns for Royal Mail on new stamp launches, and this was a series on British marine life, shot in an aquarium in Birmingham. where I was scuba diving in 1.5 meters of ice cold water for about an hour, trying to photograph 6 stamps and the 6 marine species associated with them. Not straightforward. This was a set of stamps on magic, Trooping the Color, Ice Age, which I particularly enjoyed doing. We came up with a concept together. This is another from the Ice Age series. And probably the trickiest lighting I've ever had to set up in the studio was this one on music. So some sort of day-to-day newsy images, all sort of newspaper type assignments. This is a very nasty drug dealer who was collared, thankfully. And just by happen chance, that bus kind of moved by in the background, rat on a rat, which I thought was quite cool. This is another drugs raid. And another bus that happened to drive by at the right time with, I don't know if you can read the hate at the top of it, but this is another drugs raid. I don't know if anyone remembers this siege in Hackney over Christmas, must be at least 15 years ago now, that went on for about 11 days, started on Boxing Day. So this is the first night there. I managed to get into a great position to very quietly take this picture of them trying to negotiate with the Yardi gangster who was holed up in this flat. He'd opened fire on a parking attendant who was giving him a parking ticket for parking on a double yellow line. And then a firefight took place when the armed police turned up, and then the siege continued because he had a hostage, which then turned out to be his flatmate. So it sort of fooled everyone into thinking he'd taken a hostage. And roll on 11 days, this is the end of the siege, when police went up on both sides and fired stun grenades and shot him 11 days later. This is a pro-hunt demonstration. Another drugs raid. This Gaza protest by pro-Palestinian demonstrators. 12,000 or so protesters took to the streets. This is from that as well. Sadly followed by rioting. My approach to photography as a whole, which carries on into news photography, is of course looking for the moment and the content to tell the story. But light is a really important part of how I shoot. So I always like walking around and trying to find these sort of interesting lighting sort of moments. And of course, this is photojournalism, so nothing is manipulated. It's just basic exposure and white balance, and perhaps a sort of a little vignette and a bit of dodging and burning. But you know, this is sort of how the image was taken. This was the largest drugs raid I've ever photographed. There was 400 police officers who raided this huge housing estate in Stonebridge and arrested, if I remember, 11 drug dealers and recovered a firearm as well. This is from an 11-hour armed police siege in Harrow, of all places. And this was the first time in the UK that a verdict suicide by cop was called after the guy ran at the police fully armed and had no choice but to shoot him. And he died shortly after. London's darkest hour. This is July the 7th, 2005. And this day started out as a very normal day. I was at the Natural History Museum waiting to photograph a diamond exhibition, which was due to open the next day, and in a holding room along with 15 or 20 colleagues. And the way the museum were doing it was they were letting us through 2 by 2 to photograph the world's largest uncut diamond. And we're hanging out, eating pastries and drinking coffee. And my phone went, and I was on assignment for the Press Association. And my picture editor said there'd been an electricity power surge in Aldgate, and sort of head that way immediately. So I dropped everything, started walking out. And it was one of these Hollywood moments, because as I walked out, everyone else's phone started to ring one by one by one. And on the way there, I heard on the radio that there'd been this explosion, and my picture editor phoned up and said, actually, there's been another electricity power surge in Edgware Road. So go there instead. And the second he said that, my mind flashed back to 9/11 and the second airplane hitting the Twin Towers, the second of the Twin Towers. And I knew immediately this was a terrorist attack, because my entire career I'd been to one power surge, which was in Camden, and it just never happens twice. And sadly, my gut was correct. We still didn't know for a fact that this was a bombing, but I got to Edgware Road because it was closer to where I was, and eerily quiet. There was no sound. Emergency services just doing their job professionally without any fuss. And then the first wave of passengers came out of the tube station looking visibly shocked, but still no inkling as to what had happened. And then there was this short lull, and Davinia Turrell, the lady in the face mask, came out being helped by Paul Dadge, who was just a passenger. And then it hit me, because, this was underground, so there was no way of knowing how bad it was. And the second I saw, I knew something really terrible had happened. And for me, the image of Davinia is the most immediately powerful, but this image resonates a lot as well, because it's got that sort of brave, stiff upper lip of, carrying on regardless. And, he's almost a guy going to work, were it not for the blood on his neck and head and suit and the newspaper. So confusion, shock. And I think this lady had probably processed it the quickest, because she was the only person I saw who was actually crying. Everyone else was still in this, I guess, in the first stages. And this was the triage area in the Hilton, which was just behind where I was standing. Incidentally, with 11 other colleagues, because we'd all been at this photo call in Kensington. It was quite a short drive, and it was one of these rare things where an immediate news story is breaking, and there's journalists actually being able to get that. And as the day wore on, I started photographing that sort of ripple effect of other things that were happening to do with the bombing. And of course, everywhere where there was TVs, people were stopping to see what was going on, or the tube stations were shut. The Evening Standard had a story out very quickly. So people were reading that, tourists trying to figure out why they can't move. So that was an extremely dark day. On to happier moments. Being stopped by the police and treated as a protester. This is the annoying thing when photographing demonstrations and so on, is that the police will do this thing called kettling, where they sort of herd together protesters and try and separate them, but they herd us in with everyone else, and it gets very frustrating, because you might see a great picture down sort of 50 meters away, but you can't get to it because the cops are sort of pushing and harassing you. So anyway, this was one of those moments, and this was at a demonstration, environmental activists at Heathrow protesting against a new runway. So I spent a few days covering this story, sometimes not being welcome, sometimes being welcome. And these are by far the best demonstrators I've ever seen. This is the clown army, who are actually very serious in what they do, but they do it in such a light-hearted way that the cops generally don't know how to react. It's quite funny. She sort of sneaked a banana skin onto this officer's handcuffs. This couple had nipped to the local bakery to bring back some food. It's the climate camp. One of the more weird things, this is Aaron Barshak, known as the comedy terrorist, who gatecrashed Prince William's birthday and became news for a week. And the weird thing was that there must have been at least 30 photographers there, probably more, 40 photographers there outside Windsor Castle, sort of photographing people coming and going. And this chap started doing his sort of comedy act, and quite a few of us photographed him. Some just ignored him because he wasn't an A-list celebrity or royal. And I wired one or two pictures of him back to the press association. And the next day it turned out that he was a gatecrasher, and I had an exclusive because no one else had bothered to send anything in, and some hadn't bothered to photograph him. So it's quite an interesting lesson in always keeping eyes open. One of the trickiest assignments, this is a naked bike ride, and it's practically impossible to photograph in a tasteful way that's suitable for newspaper use, but I managed to get a couple of nice shots. This one was published quite widely. And this, although it looks like it might be from the same dude, this is different. This is a hat stand and table, believe it or not, by a designer called Alan Jones, and this is from his Mannequin Furniture series made in '69. And this is Sotheby's staff unwrapping it ready for viewing for an auction of the Gunter Sachs collection. Each one of these pieces was estimated to go for between 30 and 40 grand. Sir Richard Branson and supermodel Karolina Kournakova. He has this thing where he likes to chuck supermodels into pools. So this was shot in Miami on a press trip for Virgin Atlantic. This was a pretty cool self-set assignment in Germany. This is the Robot World Cup. It's called Robo Cup, and it's football for robots, basically. And the sort of blurry movements you can see on the pitch are little cubes, and they're autonomous. There's no human interaction, so each team has their robot cubes, and they program them as they see fit, and then they play football. And there's different sort of leagues and different groups, and this guy's robot just wasn't playing ball at all. So, of course, the bipeds are the most interesting. No Terminators, but, you know, perhaps the beginning of things to come. And of course, to the very important world of fashion. I really enjoy photographing fashion, weirdly. I think partly it's an antidote and sort of levels the sadder moments of life. But also I find that sort of, especially backstage, the buzz that happens backstage always attracts me. So this is Naomi Campbell, who chucked out every single photographer who was backstage with me. You need to have special accreditation anyway to go to the fashion show, and then more special accreditation to get backstage. So it was only about 4 or 5 of us, but she didn't, I don't know why, she didn't like the look of 4 of my colleagues and kicked them out. So I was the only one who kind of managed to stay there, and very gently and with smiles, sort of photograph her getting made up. So respect and slow movements tend to work. Of course, these models rush through from show to show to show, and although it seems like a very easy way to make a living, it's sometimes it isn't. hassle of backstage and the elegance of runway here with the same model. And I always like finding interesting angles. You can see all the photographers there at the end of the runway taking the sort of classic shot, but for me, trying to find interesting ways to shoot always works. Of course, this is back at the front again. These are two different images I've put together. I worked, part of my work is video as well, is filmmaking. So I was commissioned along with a dear friend of mine, Neil Patience, who sadly is no longer with us, who produced and edited this project. We're commissioned by the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital to help them with a fundraising film that they were going to use as one of the tools in raising funds for the redevelopment. And Princess Eugenie had a spinal surgery there, so Prince Andrew was a patron, and then later she became a patron as well. So this is me setting up to do an interview with Prince Andrew on video. And weirdly, and the client didn't know this is the very first time I'd done a piece to camera interview. So to say I was nervous would be putting it mildly, but thankfully, you know, being prepared and knowing the gear sort of paid off, and I managed to shoot it sort of quite well. This is filming inside one of the operating theaters, gowned up and so on. And alongside the film, I convinced the client to let me shoot a photo reportage as well to go along, to be sent out to the papers and magazines along with the film once they launched their fundraising campaign, and they agreed. So it was great sort of traveling the corridors with a couple of cameras, access all areas to be able to shoot images to go along with this documentary. And the film was premiered in St. James's Palace in this massive hall at a party hosted by Prince Andrew. And Neil and I were, of course, very nervous, you know, to see how it would be accepted. And when the film finished, there was about 400 guests in this massive hall, and there wasn't a single sound apart from the sound of people sniffling and crying. And we looked at each other and we smiled because we knew the film had succeeded. And there was also an exhibition of the photographs. This is Princess Eugenie looking through the images. And I was told by her aides that she really liked one of the video clip of her. So I made a still print of it and presented it to her in an IKEA frame. So it's probably the only piece of IKEA furniture in this palace. And that's the frame that goes around my picture. This was a 2-day shoot with in Los Angeles with TV presenter Andrea Fechko, and Olympus sent me out to LA to shoot with the then unannounced m.zuiko 25mm 1.8. So I spent a week in LA, 2 days with Andrea, shooting various things, all with the 25 1.8, and these are a selection of the images with Andrea. And I've always loved the 50mm focal length. It's so extremely versatile, and I didn't shoot with any other lens for that duration. On to sort of more newspapery kind of stuff. It's Mark Ruffalo, better known as the Hulk nowadays. Jerry Hall, this was for the National Lottery. These are lottery numbers on her leg, naturally. Lizzie Jagger, another shoot for the National Lottery. Nell McAndrew, another shoot for the lottery. This was the Euro Millions, and these are all obviously studio shots. To one of the most offbeat sort of pictures. This was for the DVD launch of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So we went with a bunch of Oompa Loompas to the London Eye to enjoy a ride, and the look on people's faces as they saw the Oompa Loompas and then a huge big photographer behind them was quite funny. This is from an anti-war rally. Dragon's Den's Duncan Bannatyne. This is a no smoking campaign promotional image. The message being, if you're smoking, it's like you're burning money. That was published quite widely. Manic Street Preachers. Ellie Goulding. This is at a party in the Versace mansion in Miami, which was quite a cool thing to be at. Pardon me. This is Alex James, the bassist from Blur, who is also a cheesemaker. So this was a shoot for Asda. Sir Richard Branson in Canada. It's a portrait commission from Gordon Ramsay himself for his new restaurant, the Union Street Cafe. And the funniest thing about this was I'd obviously arrived ahead of time, set up a couple of lights, and he'd met me before at a food awards, which is how I guess I got the commission to shoot him in his new restaurant. And he turned up and we chatted a bit, and I told him where I wanted him to sit for the first shot. And I opened my bag and I took out a Leica M9, and he kind of looked at the camera and kind of looked at me and he said, "That's a bit small, isn't it?" I could tell that he was thinking, we're paying this guy and he's using toy cameras. And of course I told him not to worry, and that it was going to work out fine. And then he sort of chilled out and we sort of took the images. But this is something I get asked quite a lot is, what if a client sees your Micro Four Thirds camera? It's not the camera, it's how you approach people and how you approach taking pictures. This was taken, it's one of my favorite portraits, and it was taken at the press launch of the EM1 in Ireland on a m.zuiko 75mm, lit with a tungsten light through a softbox. And it was just a test shot, but there's something about it I really like, and it's remained one of my favorite portraits. This is Jordan Abbott. This was shot on a EM1 as well. It's mezzo-soprano Ida Ransloff, an amazing opera singer. Welsh soprano Carly Owen. This is one of the highlights of my career. I really loved shooting this project. It started off as a personal project. And I really wanted to spend time and shoot a proper in-depth photo essay, because it's the kind of stuff we used to do back in the good old days when newspapers were bought by people and read, and therefore there was money for people to shoot proper projects. And I set myself this project of documenting an opera start to end. And this was done at the Royal College of Music, and I'm tremendously thankful to them for accepting my idea and letting me shoot this, and also for Olympus for supporting this project. It took 7 months to shoot, resulting in 31,794 pictures, which then took 2 months of editing, processing, and design for an exhibition, which resulted in 62 of these photographs making it to an outdoor exhibition on the South Bank, just by the National Theatre. And it was really a fascinating journey for me, and definitely one of the highlights of my 31-year career. And it was every aspect of opera, of this opera. So it started with the auditions, and a lot of sort of fly on the wall kind of things. She's nervously waiting for her turn to go on stage. And then many, many months of rehearsals. And part of the reason I overshot so much was that I'd go to rehearsal after rehearsal after rehearsal, and you never know what's going to give you the best picture. So every time, I saw a great moment, a great image, I would shoot it. And then, of course, this then meant that I had a huge task of editing ahead of me. But it also meant that I did the best job I could, and showcased all the hard work that goes into putting on a production like this. This is one of the costume fittings. And we're on to set design. set building, lighting being put together. And I'm always on the lookout for these subtle moments. And this was the backstage, the back screen being lowered down, and of course you had a sort of blue sky. And I spotted these guys' blue shoes. And I was like, oh, please let this work, please let this work. And I sort of got in position. And as it came down, he stretched his hands out to grab the canvas backdrop, and quite kind of like what happened there. So putting the stage set together. And I stood on top of this ladder for a good 15 minutes because I could see there was a picture to be had as soon as someone walked through that window aperture. But of course it didn't happen, and didn't happen, and didn't happen, and didn't happen. And eventually patience sort of gave in. Sorry, patience paid off, I should say. More rehearsals. This is the director seeing the set for the first time. Final costume fittings. Makeup. And now it's dress rehearsal time. So these are a couple of the singers sitting in the auditorium watching the scene before their scene. Waiting for the cue. And again, more rehearsals. And now the orchestra joins in with the rehearsals. The singers rehearse for many, many months, and then the orchestral musicians join in a little bit later. Getting ready. And these are the moments I found most fascinating, with these sort of quiet moments backstage with pretty much zero light, when the singers were sort of getting ready to go on stage and perform. This image ended up being the cover of the exhibition catalog, and also used in the posters. And then, of course, after the final performance, there was a big party for all the singers and so on. And then at the same night, until about 3 in the morning, was bringing down the set, recycling everything that could be recycled, and getting the theater ready for the next production. So this was shot either 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Very, very long day. So these were the tools. These are what I used to make this series. It was a couple of OMD M5 Mark II bodies with the full grips attached, which has been one of my favorite cameras of all time. Sticking mainly to prime lenses. So you can see there's a bunch of primes on there as well. But a lot of the backstage stuff, the really, really dark stuff, there's just so little light that even the sort of 1.8 lenses, back then the 1.2s went around, couldn't cut it. So I ended up getting 3 Voigtlander Nocton lenses. The Nocton lenses are 0.95. They're manual focus, but with focus peaking, you can do, with a bit of practice, you can usually do quite a good job. So I had the 10.5, 17.5, and 25 mil Nocton lenses. And even at 0.95, some of the shots were at 4000 ISO at sort of a 20th of a second shutter speed. There was so little light. But they worked well. And I shot most of them with the EM5, but on some occasions I had sort of the EM1 as well. So I had a couple of EM1s as well for some shoots. But for the front of house stuff, where there was more light, for the set building and so on, where more lights were on, the zooms also worked a treat. So these are some of the pro zooms. This is the poster that was put up all over the South Bank And the exhibition was called Opera by the River. And around 420,000 people saw it over the 11 days that it was up. So it's been a tremendous sort of highlight. I think there's a bit of a lag. Oh, here we go. So this was a custom built set, and it took a very, very long time to sort of get the layout and the design and the curation of the images, most importantly, right. And the largest pictures, there was 8 prints of images bigger than A0. So this is one of them. You can see another one there on the left. So, you know, as long as you focus properly and your exposure's good, even a 16 megapixel image will blow up beautifully. There wasn't a single criticism by any of the trade press who saw these images, because I know that as micro four thirds shooters, you know, we often get sort of snobbery of, well, your sensor's too small and so on. But I would challenge anyone to have a look at any of these images, even at A0 size, and say that they didn't work. But it was a wonderful project. It was great to have Olympus back here and let me exhibit it in the way that I envisaged it. Because for me, from the beginning, if it was going to be an exhibition, it had to be in the South Bank, sort of art central. Moving on, this was a campaign which I also thoroughly enjoyed shooting for the National Lottery. And this was to celebrate 10 years of the National Lottery. So I spent quite a bit of time with the press office at the lottery, looking through lists of winners and what they'd done with their winnings. And we chose, after a couple of days, we narrowed it down to a list of 10 who had done very interesting things with stuff that they'd got, not just a mansion and an Aston Martin, but sort of unique stuff. And this is Tony, who as a kid, his family wasn't particularly well off, and he always loved action men, but never had any. So first thing he did was, with his millions, was he went out and bought 120 action men and paraphernalia, uniforms and so on, to fulfill his sort of boyhood ambition. It was really charming sort of meeting him and seeing how happy he was. This is Tony and Greta, who purchased a pair of knee replacements each to allow them to continue their passion for dancing. This is Meredith Davis and his girlfriend, who decided that they wanted to set up a stud farm because she always loved horses, but they had no idea on how to do it. But they sort of learned on the job, and wonderful couple. This is Theo Bristow, who found that there was redevelopment that was about to happen to this beautiful patch of countryside. And she found in the bylaws that if there was woodland, woodland couldn't be cut down for building work. So she planted 13 acres of woodland to stop sort of a high-rise ruining the countryside, which is kind of quite cool. And then to the more bizarre stuff. So Sarah in the middle was the one who won the lottery and bought boob jobs for her and her 2 sisters. So that's them very happily in the studio. This family lived in quite a rough housing estate in Liverpool, and decided to relocate to Canada for a better standard of life. So this is them sort of enjoying the outdoors in British Columbia. And Sue and Peter, their dream was to have a caravan. So it was a wonderful couple. And we spent some time by this lake sort of photographing them. Very, very nice couple. This is a portrait. This was done as a demonstration day, but I really like this portrait. It's this is a 3D printed replica of the dinosaur skull of the Diplodocus, I think that's how you say it, which was the big dinosaur I think they had in one of the main halls. But we came up with this sort of creative portrait with it. This is the first ever Porsche. This was photographed in Sotheby's. It's a 1939 Type 64. This is in Los Angeles, the love of hot rods. It's a portrait for another opera singer, Angela Simkin. No, this was part of a week-long assignment for a French magazine called L'Express on the stabbing epidemic that sort of hit the UK and London. So this is a shrine left to a father who was killed, father of two who was killed, who just was trying to help someone getting attacked. It's part of the same story. It's John Costy, a reformed armed robber. Very, very nasty piece of work. But in jail, he kind of came to a realization and is now helping gang members and so on, leave gangs and so on through the use of art. It's a homeless epidemic that's going across the world very sadly. This was shot in Barcelona. And one of my big passions is kind of street photography and daily life. So I'm always with a camera anyway, because as a photojournalist, you need to be ready. You never know if you're going to stumble on an important story or not. But also as a street photographer, I just love constantly looking for moments and seeing moments. So this is sort of working alongside my professional work. And street photography, I find it, regardless of what kind of photography one either does as a profession or as a passion, street photography always keeps you sharp, because you need to be able to see something very quickly, mentally process what the light's like, how to expose it, what to compose, waiting for the right moment, and reacting, focusing, composing, and so on. So it's a good way to keep yourself sharp. And then sometimes you get so lucky, you see a guy wearing the same shade of red as the rose he's just given his girlfriend. So I was quite lucky. This was shot on EP2 long time ago, and it's sort of remained one of my favorite sort of street moments. That's the beauty of mirrorless, of course, is we can stick adapters on and stick any lens we want on there. And this was with a Leica 35mm Summicron M lens, so sort of 70mm focal length. Man feeding seagulls at sunset. Sort of London pigeons and more exotic seagulls sharing a bath. Bird's eye view. And sometimes you just get lucky, you know. This I call this image the religion of basketball. Sunset in Barcelona. An advertising hoarding, sort of lighting everyone up. Bank holiday moment by the River Thames in Bankside. And this is, you know, many people call these sort of Tate pictures a cliche, you know, everyone goes to the Tate Modern, and yeah, absolutely. But I've got a huge thing against calling anything a cliche, because something that might be called a cliche or something that's been done to death by 1,000 photographers before could be shot tomorrow, and whoever does it tomorrow makes the defining image, and then everything else becomes non-important. So this is something I always advise people, is if there's something you want to shoot, just go and shoot it and look at it and bring your fresh eye. It's fine to be inspired by something, but no need to copy it, but, you know, go and look and see and feel and shoot, because you never know, you might end up making the defining image. And I don't know if anyone has heard of a photographer called Sebastio Salgado. He's definitely one of my favorite photographers. And at the beginning of his career, he wanted to go and shoot this open gold mine in Brazil, and all of his friends told him he was stupid for thinking of doing it, because number one, he only shot in black and white. Number two, he was a nobody. And number three, National Geographic magazine had just done a big reportage on it in color. But he went and shot it, and of course his pictures are the defining images from the Sella Palada gold mine. So it's always worth having a look at stuff that you want to photograph, be it as an assignment or be it just for personal passion reasons. Colorful moments along the streets. This I shot this as a test for the S1, which had just which I'd just got at this stage, and I was sorry, not the S1, the 51.4, which I just got at this stage on the S1, the Lumix S1. I went into Covent Garden and stuck it on face and eye detect on continuous focus, and it seemed to nail 80% of people rushing around. So this is one of the other great things with our mirrorless cameras, is sort of eye detect and face detect, which works really, really well. Some moments in the British Museum. It's all about the light, just waiting and looking and waiting and looking and seeing. So this, the next set are from a campaign I shot for Panasonic Japan, Panasonic Lumix Japan, for the launch of the 24-70 Lumix S Pro 24-70 2.8 lens. And it was one of these dream assignments. It was a commercial assignment, and they just said, go and shoot whatever you like. And I had a couple of weeks, and I sort of sat down and put together a list of things that I wanted to shoot, and some of them were assignments that were already in the diary. A lot of them were things that I came up with myself to shoot. So these images are part of the set that I put together, and 10 images were used in the international campaign. This is after a polo match. Horses are being cooled down with water. It's a model, airplane maker and racer. Oh, sorry, pardon me, I jumped one. This is a director, theatre director, Stephen Unwin. There's 2 images of him. It's a clockmaker. And as he was moving, clock repair, as he was moving the chassis, the sort of brass chassis, this reflection of light hit his face, and I just was so lucky in seeing that. Sort of really elevated the image. Alpine soldiers in Italy. This is Max Moore, who's a TV host, German TV host. This is British designer Joshua Kane. Yoonsley Park, world-class violinist from Korea. And I always love sort of getting these contrasts in images. You know, we sort of, you know, she's dressed in this kind of gown ready for a high-end sort of concert with silver stilettos and so on, and an amazing violin. And then there was this sort of tunnel where this construction work was going on. And it's just nice sort of getting that sort of contrast in an image. I think it always makes it more interesting. Some street moments. Oh, I apologize. I've got that picture in twice. Anyway, that's been me. I think, let's see if we can stop screen sharing and start having a chat. I hope I haven't been too boring.
Not at all. Thank you so much for that Edmond. That was an amazing journey with you through your career, and I'm sure I represent everyone by saying thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, we've gone on for a very long time, and I'm happy to go on for as long as people want, but I noticed some people have put some questions up on the chat. I'm finding it quite difficult to read the chat, but we do have some questions which were sent in advance, which Edmond has probably been able to mull over. The first question was asking about full frame and micro four thirds. I think we've kind of covered that because
yeah, I mean, you know, the question is, how do I choose between full frame and micro four thirds? How do I know what to choose for when? And you know, as I mentioned, lightweight, inconspicuous, and small is always a big consideration for me. So the easiest way to make the choice is, if I can do the assignment on micro four thirds bodies, that's what I'll use. The advantage isn't just lightweight and small, it's also things like having a range of lenses, which are impossible to have on full frame. You know, huge long zoom lengths and so on. So if I can shoot in that way, I will do that. And then conversely, if I need to have optimum quality, or if I'm shooting in extremely low light, then a full frame sensor comes into play. So it's about the right tool for the right job. Basically, you know, hammers are great, but they're not great for everything. Sometimes you need a screwdriver. So that's how I make my choice, and it's just great to have the ability to do that. And depending on what one shoots, sometimes one doesn't need to have that sort of wide an option, but it's just in my career, because I shoot such a wide variety of different things, it's just having the right tool set for the right job. But as I mentioned during the part with the exhibition Opera by the River, it's you know, anyone who sort of speaks in a snobbish way about not having a full frame camera is quite frankly missing the point, because you know, if you technically are proficient and you get your focus right, your exposure right, and of course the picture's an interesting picture, you can have up to an A0 print. I mean, how many people print A0 nowadays? You know, practically no one I know of. But yeah. Another question is, I'd be really interested if you could talk a few minutes in general about experiences in Armenia. In particular, did you set out with an aim, style, and story in mind, or did these develop and emerge? So when I approach an assignment, I try and do as much research as possible, because if you haven't got a clue about the story, you can't do it any justice. So highlighting aspects, for example, in the earthquake, highlighting aspects of the difficulties people are facing now. These are all important in planning an idea of how to tackle the story. But a lot of it also is then dependent on who you meet, people you talk to, what they say, and always being open to new ideas. I've worked with journalists in the past who have had one idea in their mind and not listened to reality, and it's ridiculous. So, you know, I always do research and try and form an idea, but keep my eyes and ears completely open, because when you meet people on the street, that's where you understand exactly what's going on. As far as a style, no, I'm never aware of a style, and this is something I think a lot of photographers get caught up on, is thinking about style or emulating people whose work they like and so on. And my advice on that is, that's fine to do at the beginning of a journey. We all do. We all sort of look at work that we admire and photographers whose work we admire. But once you've got over that and you're technically proficient, is just go out and shoot. And it reaches a point where you're just taking pictures. You're not thinking of a style. You're thinking of the light. You're thinking of the moment. You're thinking of the composition. You're thinking of the elements in the picture and what do they mean to the viewer. But you're not sort of consciously thinking, oh, I'm going to shoot to this style or that style, because that then becomes fake. And I suppose the easiest comparison I can make is those who drive and those who learn to drive manual gearbox cars. In the beginning, it's a nightmare because you're constantly thinking about biting point and, oh my God, I don't want to stall, and oh, should I change gear now? Oh my, what's the revs? But once you become a proficient driver, you don't think about any of that at all. You just get and start the car and you're driving. And it's that kind of parallel, I think. We shouldn't be aware of these things. We should just look at the scene, whatever that scene may be, and do it justice.
I've just deciphered a couple of questions on the chat, and I think these might tie in a little bit. This is, I think, reference to your black and white work during the film days. Somebody's asking, did you use HP5?
I did use HP5, but not that much. My favorite film was actually Kodak Tri-X.
Aha.
So most of what you saw was on Kodak Tri-X, yeah. But HP5 was nice, but I just preferred Tri-X, and I also really like Neopan 1600 and Kodak, so Neopan's Fuji, and then Kodak T-Max 3200, which you could push to 6400. I mean, you'd have grain the size of a golf ball, but when you needed it, you needed it. I mean, we're so spoilt now with our digital cameras; it's unbelievable. But
indeed,
it was really tough. Yeah.
There's another question here, which is just paraphrasing. It's basically talking about deadlines and schedules. And what when you get professional commissions, I would presume that there's a mixture of. Well, you mentioned the Panasonic work. They gave you a free rein, but in other commissions, you probably have a very tight commission.
Yeah, I mean, the Panasonic one was actually very tight. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks to produce 10 images to use on an international campaign is actually extremely tight. But my newspaper assignments are extremely tight. You know, that 2 week thing becomes a luxury. So no, newspaper work, you need to wire the images back the second you finish shooting. So we'd always carry laptops. I mean, now things have moved on a lot. You know, we can use iPhones. I find it amazing that I can Wi-Fi a picture to my iPhone and process a 48 megapixel raw image using Lightroom Mobile. I mean, who would ever have imagined such a thing? And then, of course, caption it and send it all from the iPhone. So for the newspaper stuff, it's immediate. It's very, very quick. I photographed President Obama visiting Downing Street to see Prime Minister Cameron, and it was absolutely heaving it down with rain. And I was shooting with my OMDs, my EM5s, and so I had two EM5s. I had the 12 to 40 2.8 and the 40 to 150 2.8. That 40 to 150 is just perfect for this kind of assignment. And of course, all my colleagues were there. And we shot away as it came. They shook hands and they went inside. And of course, everyone was grappling around to where they can open up their laptop because, you know, rain laptops don't mix. And I kind of decided not to use my laptop. And I just switched on the Wi-Fi and the cameras, took out my iPhone, kind of leant over it so not so much rain was falling on it. And I did my edit, wired the raw pictures to the phone, edited them, captioned them, sent them to my agency, and I was done. And colleagues were still clamoring around trying to find shelter so they could open their Macs and their PCs and so on. But yeah, so those things are very, very quick. Things like the opera thing, again, there's a deadline at the end of it because, you know, you book an exhibition space and so on. But sometimes you've got a little bit more time, but newspaper work is immediate. That every second that passes means that a competitor's image may make it instead of yours. So
Um, I've got a couple of questions again on the chat. The first one is, how did the police treat you when you're getting close to people in places like this? And kind of related, I come across situations in London. How does one start to get images published? So maybe one after the other.
Yeah. So the police, just like anything else, you know, we're all human. So you get amazing police officers and you get absolute, I can't think of a
careful, careful.
But you get, I mean, it's like, I don't know, booking a plumber to do a job for you. You know, some are amazing, some are terrible, some are cowboys, some are professional, and it's the same. So, you know, I have several very, very good friends who are police officers and detectives and so on, and I've come across that full gamut of amazing to awful people. So it just depends. I mean, I showed that slide of me being kettled in with the demonstrators in Heathrow, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes they're decent, sometimes they're not. Probably one of the worst situations I had was, there's been a couple, but one of the weirdest, bizarrest, worst situations I had was the Palestinian demo, which I showed some pictures for, which sadly turned into a full-on riot, and the police were getting hammered with street furniture being chucked at them, with things being set alight and thrown at them, and they had my full sympathy. But they set up a funneling system where they would grab demonstrators and chuck them down this kind of double row of police officers called a funnel, and they would start to disperse people. But as I said earlier, they kind of count us as demonstrators, which is very annoying, to put it mildly. And, you know, my time came and I was pushed down this thing. And then this territorial support group officer, so the TSG are the biggest, toughest police, who are fully kitted out, and they're the real sort of hard nuts. This guy took it upon himself to escort me out, and I was complying, because there's no point not complying in these situations. And he sort of grabbed my arm and he frog marched me down High Street, Kensington, away from the Israeli embassy where the rioting was. And I was just chatting with him, and we got to the end, and I could see he was so riled up and full of adrenaline. He was itching for me to do something so he could hit me or arrest me or something. And of course, I was just being pleasant and chatting to him, you know, very calmly. And he was so annoyed at the end of this that he just looked at me, and then he pushed me, both hands, straight on my chest. I didn't fall down, but I sort of stumbled backwards. And I stood there and very calmly said, "Are you happy now? What was that about?" And he was just like itching for a fight. And in the end, thankfully, he controlled himself and walked away. And you kind of get, you know, you're like, what's happening? But, you know, I've had the opposite as well. And at the end of the day, you know, we need to realize that police officers do an extremely difficult job. Even the ones who wind us up on occasion, you know, they do an extremely difficult job. Sometimes it's hard to discern good guys from the bad guys, and sort of how to balance things. So my approach has always been just to be kind and just to speak calmly and try and explain that what we're doing is important as well. And actually, in police guidelines, they've got strict guidelines on how to deal with the media. But of course, some of them don't read the guidelines, or some of them just hate the press. And the hatred is kind of institutionalized up to a point, because if a police officer is doing something wrong and they get photographed doing it, that's it, they're out. And they don't want that to happen. You know, we all make mistakes during our jobs and stuff, but if a police officer is doing something really bad and they get photographed, this is bad for their career, obviously, and their pension and so on. So I think this is part of the reason why there's, even from sort of training days, they get, you know, don't trust the press, don't trust the photographers and so on. And of course, it's hugely unfair, because, you know, not all photographers are the same, but that's that. And then, sorry, remind me what the second question was?
Yeah, and I think we'll make that the last one, because we've been going for an hour and a half. Basically, it's a question about, I come across situations in London. How does one start to get images published?
You need to, Okay, it depends. If one wants to become a newspaper photographer, then you need to find the paper or papers that you really admire and just stick with them and keep calling them and keep offering them pictures that you've taken immediately, not sort of 2 days later. Also make sure that everything you say is as 100% accurate as you could possibly be. Don't try and fudge it or exaggerate or do anything, because if something like that gets into print, you could be in trouble from whoever's in the picture or whatever you're insinuating, but also you'll be mud as far as that publication's concerned. You'll never get anything published again. So we go to great lengths to make sure that we're journalistically 100% accurate, or as accurate as we could possibly be given the information at that split second. Things like metadata, IPTC captioning are absolutely crucial. So if you don't know it already, if you look in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever program you use, there will be metadata, or there should be metadata editing. And that caption box, credit box, and place and date and so on are crucial, because on average, a newspaper on a normal day will get, I think the numbers have gone up even more now, around 16,000 pictures on a normal day. If it's something like the Cannes Film Festival, or there's been a particularly bad terrorist incident or something, that jumps up by thousands and thousands more. So the only way your pictures are seen are if someone's searching for them. If you send a picture in and it's amazing, make sure you phone and you tell someone as well. And you can send pictures via FTP, which are more guarded details. So a casual person wouldn't get an FTP detail, but picture desks have emails as well. So it'd be pictures@thetimes.co.uk, for example. But make sure you phone up and speak to a human and explain what you've just seen. Hopefully they'll be interested, and then they'll search for the picture. But if, for example, you photographed a demonstration, let's say a big demonstration, then the newspaper picture desk will no doubt search for the best images from that demonstration and might put in anti-war demo Trafalgar Square, for example. So if you've got all that information in your IPTC, that will come up in their search, and if your picture's good enough, it may get into print. If you're not aiming to be a newspaper photographer, but just photograph something interesting, either newsworthy or very aesthetically perfect, then it's just a case of, again, phone the papers who you think that picture's suited to. If you've shot a phenomenally beautifully lit image that's just visually delicious and just wonderful, then probably the Daily Star or the Daily Mail and so on aren't the papers to call, whereas the Guardian, the Times, the Independent are. So it's find make sure you target the right market for the image that you've taken. Conversely, if you photograph, I don't know, Kim Kardashian eating a donut or something, then I wouldn't bother with the Guardian and the Independent and the Times, but call the Mail or the Sun or one of those places. So it's identifying the right audience, basically.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to call it time there, because I think we can all have too much of a good thing. I just want to thank you so much for being a fantastic host and to share your amazing images. I've learned a hell of a lot about you today, and I've known you a little bit. Fantastic insights. So thank you again. And assuming that the recording has worked, it'll be archived on our YouTube channel, and people who haven't been able to see it will be able to see it there. So thank you again, Edmond, and stay safe. And let's just look forward to the time when we can get out there and use our cameras again out in the street, because I know street photography is one of the most popular genres, apart from bird photography, I think, on the E-Group. And I think that you've provided a lot of inspiration and ideas. So thank you again.
My pleasure. And it's I'm sorry to say this. It's well, obvious to 99% of us, but occasionally I see people on Facebook asking this. it's now's not the time to want to exercise our freedoms and go out and make pictures and so on. You know, as journalists, we're considered as key workers, but even then, we're not just roving around the streets. We're only going on absolute assignments because it's so easy to pick up this virus, and chances are maybe it won't harm us, but someone else we meet, we could pass it on quite easily. So, you know, keep safe, stay home. And you know, the longer more people do this, the sooner the whole thing will be
indeed
hopefully over. So everyone keep safe, and thank you so much for tuning in. I hope
Thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay then, guys. See you at the next one. Okay.
Cheers, all. Thank you.
Thank you.